Wesley So plays on both sides of the board in an attempt to dominate his opponent. His opponent is no slouch. It's Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, more commonly known as MVL, and the tournament is the 2022 FIDE Grand Prix. MVL has white. He had a rating of 2761. Wesley So with black had a rating of 2778. Let's jump right in. MVL begins with d4. Knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop to b4. We have a Nimzo Indian on the board. Wesley So would like to damage white's pawn structure and control the e4 square. MVL plays f3, a very aggressive move. The most common moves these days are queen to c2 or e3. F3 is designed to gain a full pawn center with e4, and he's saying, I don't actually care if you damage my pawns. I'm going to use my space to suffocate you. c5. So this f3 move weakened the dark square, the e3 square, so Wesley So immediately attacks the dark squares in the center with the move c5, hitting d4. d5 is played, gaining space, and now b5. This is a very aggressive system from black. It looks kind of like a Blumenfeld gambit, but in the Blumenfeld gambit, the bishop is on f8 still. Now the bishop is posted at b4. Very sharp play. e4, keeping the center intact. And now d6 and knight g to e2, connecting the knights. So if the bishop takes, he can retake with the knight. The problem is he does block in his bishop at f1. He could have played bishop to d2. That was another option. But knight g to e2, and now pawn takes pawn. The bishop doesn't have access to c4, so he goes ahead and takes, but now the knight moves to f4, allows the bishop to take, and also adds some strength to white's center. So Wesley So makes an important decision here. He plays e5. What he's doing is locking up the center. So play is going to take place on the wings. Also, and this is very important, knights tend to do better in locked structures than bishops, and we'll see how the players handle that principle as the game progresses. So he moves his knight. It was attacked. Wesley So plays knight b to d7, and here a very common move is knight to g3, allowing the bishop to take on c4 and threatening to jump into f5, but instead MVL plays g4 first. He wants to play that and then play knight g3, but Wesley So doesn't want him to get comfortable, so he immediately attacks white's structure with h5. Now here, MVL could play g5, and if the knight goes to h7, attacking the pawn, play h4. The only issue for white is that it's a little harder to generate activity on the king side when the structure is locked up. So instead of advancing, he goes ahead and plays knight to g3 right away. g6 is played. Not only does it defend h5, but it also keeps the knight. The knight really would love to go to that f5 square, so it keeps him out of f5. MVL goes ahead and takes the pawn. Bishop takes, pawn takes. So he's intentionally, Wesley So has given up the two bishops. He's saying, my knights are going to be better than your bishops in this position. He also creates a target on c3, which Wesley So immediately goes after with the move queen to a5. Queen to d3, you'd rather not have a queen defending a pawn if you can help it, but that's what MVL has really needed to do. Knight to b6, threatening knight takes bishop, and then the bishop can come to a6 and hit the queen and gain control of a very important diagonal. If, say, white were to play bishop to d2, then knight takes, queen takes, and then rook to b8 first, controlling this square. So now bishop to a6 would actually be threatening to win the queen outright. So the queen would need to move. Bishop a6, block with c4, but then queen a4, attack c4 twice, rook to c1, and rook to b2. And you can just see black's initiative is beginning to get a bit out of control. So instead of allowing that, MVL plays bishop to b5 check. Bishop to d7, and then you have the exchange of bishops. Wesley takes with the b knight. He could take knight f d7. The problem is pawn takes, and then white gets access to that f5 square he's been wanting so badly. So instead he takes knight b d7. g5, and here knight h7 is a possibility, then h4. But white can still maybe hope to gain some counterplay with the f-pawn. So what Wesley So does very powerfully, instead of retreating his knight, he counterattacks with the move h4. And it would be a mistake for white to take the knight, because then just pawn takes knight. There's a pin on the h-file, the knight's threatening to take on f6, and black is in very, very good shape here. So basically white has to move his knight, which he does, knight to e2. Now the knight goes to h5, helping to control this very important f4 square. White castles, rook to b8, controlling the only fully open file on the board. And now f4. White is hoping to gain activity. It's really the only pawn break he has, and he hopes to gain activity along the f file. Now here black could take the pawn to give his knight access to the e5 square. After knight f4, knight e5, hitting the queen, queen moves queen to b5. Computers see this as equal, but personally to the eye test, it looks like black is better to me, but computers say it's equal. Wesley did not go that way. Instead, he played queen to a4. The idea is, first, the queen could go to d1 later if the rook were to relinquish control, but the main idea is to play c4 so the knight can hop into c5 and then maybe even d3 later, a very common theme in Benoni pawn structures. So white goes ahead with f5. Pawn takes, rook takes f5, and now Wesley plays his key idea here, c4, hitting the queen. The queen goes to e3, and since the rook is not on f1, queen to d1 check is played by Wesley. The rook retreats to block the check, and now queen to d3, and this is a very sneaky move. Now, if white just takes the queen, that would be a bad blunder, because pawn takes queen, and you see the knight on e2 is completely trapped. There's no place for it to go. If he plays queen to f3, let's say, then the exchange of queens, and now knight to c5, and white's going to lose a pawn. The only way to defend this pawn is to play rook to e3, but then rook to g8, hitting the g5 pawn. This rook is inconveniently blocking the c1 bishop, and he will have to give up one pawn or the other. Black is in great shape. So what white does instead is play queen to f2, aiming at the f7 pawn to deliver check. And Wesley says, you know what, I can live with that. That's actually okay. So he takes the very important central pawn at e4, queen f7 check, king to d8, and actually Wesley So is threatening to just play king c7, bring the b8 rook over to f8 and kick that queen out and be in very good shape. So MVL just gets the queen out immediately. Queens come off the board, and now Wesley So has a new target. Can you see the weakest square in white's position? That's right, the d5 pawn. So he plays rook to b5, directly going after that weakness. Bishop to e3 attacks a7. Rook takes d5. Now rook to b1. Yes, he could take the pawn now, but then the rook is able to go to d2. The bishop doesn't control that square. The rook becomes very active. So he plays rook to b1, putting his rook on the open file. But now rook to a5, defends a7, and attacks a2. Rook to b7, attacks a7. The king moves, and now rooks come off the board. Rook to a8, bishop to f2, and rook takes a2, attacking the knight on e2. So we have a long series of moves where it's one attack after another. And right now, even white is aiming at the h4 pawn. First, he has to defend his knight with king to f1. Knight goes to f8. He wants to play to this nice g6 square. Bishop takes on h4, and knight to g6. Now, these knights are on the side of the board, it's true, but they're actually very, very well placed. Blockading this g5 pawn, they have access to the f4 square. So these knights might not look good to some players, but they're actually really good knights. He blocked the structure so the knights would beat the bishops. Bishop to f2, king to e6, bringing his king up in an endgame. Bishop to b6, rook to a1 check, king f2, knight hf4, knight takes f4 check. And here it would be a mistake for Wesley to take with the knight, because after bishop e3, white has a good chance of holding this endgame. Let's say king f5, king g3, h4 check, and then you just take here, and this is just a drawn rook and pawn endgame, pretty much a textbook draw. So instead he takes with the pawn, leaving this strong knight on g6 to defend this pawn. Rook to h3, perhaps playing rook to h6 to pin the knight. The king comes to f5, so the rook goes to h7. Now he can check from behind and maybe threaten to take the pawn that's at f4. But now knight to e5. If he just takes on g5, then the king can come to f3. This is still good for black, but not quite as good as the game, where instead of that, he plays knight to e5, and he creates a barrier here. The knight and the pawn make it very hard for white's king to make any progress moving forward. This is a very strong formation for black. h4, defending the g5 pawn, which was now attacked, and king to g4. And just compare these two kings. Black's king is much better placed. g6, knight takes, rook to g7, pinning the knight. So he defends the knight with king to f5. Now h5 hits the knight, gaining a tempo, knight to e5, and now h6. And this pawn at h6 looks very, very dangerous. So how is Wesley So going to deal with it? Well, first he puts his rook behind the pawn. The pawn goes to h7, and now he attacks the rook with his own king. And remember, White's king can't move forward. Rook to a7, and now king to g6, attacking the pawn. King goes to g2, hitting black's rook, so take, take, take. And now bishop to c7. Hitting the d6 pawn of the d6 pawn move, he takes the knight. So how does Wesley So deal with this? Well, he says, I'm going to give you the d6 pawn, and I'm going to activate my king. King goes forward, bishop to c5, and now king to e4. And again, black's king dominates. Bishop to d4, knight to g4. Now he's controlling the square in front of the pawn that wants to move forward to queening. King to f1, king to d3. Now here black's plan is to move the pawn to f2, and white either has to relinquish this queening square or give up the pawn at c3. And in this position, white, MVL, resigned, because this is what would have happened. He would just have to make tempo moves. And the pawn goes to f2, and then black just moves his king to f3. And here he threatens mate at h2 or maybe at e3, so the pawn would have to be taken, and the bishop lost. And Wesley So defeated Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Now, even going off over this great game from Wesley So, there is still some great chess that you are missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the game you're going to want to look at is in this video right here. So be sure to check out this incredible game from Wesley So. I'm sure you're going to love it.